Hello, Communication 15 students. We are entering our third week now, and so I wanted to go back now and talk a little bit about the reading that I assigned to you, the Computer-Mediated Communication Chapters 1 and 2. I'm just going to cover Chapters 1 for right now. Um, First of all, I really enjoyed getting to read all of your posts. That kind of gave me an idea of where people's thoughts or minds were and what you pulled out. So let's just kind of go through this lesson a little bit. Just to kind of break it up. So in the reading, it gave a little brief history about how the internet sort of began and how this first electronic digital computer was actually invented during World War II, and that later on it became a prototype for emails to be exchanged in the 1960s. I have a couple images of what computers used to look like, and I hate to say it, but I actually saw one that looked very similar to the picture at the bottom. But when we think in terms of how long this has been, we're only looking at 50 years worth of computer-mediated communication, which is not very long. And we know that within the last 20 years, computers have just expanded to a place where they've become very personal because now everyone owns them, not just one per family, but actually individuals have their own. So this brings me to a couple of key important elements here. When we talk about classical theories, we generally are talking about foundational theories that set the stage, if you will, for future study. And those studies, those theories kind of evolve and morph as they go through the years, and people pick up on different elements. Well, when we talk about communication, we generally have to go all the way back to Aristotle. And so when you think in terms of how far back that is, it's pretty fascinating that the classical theories in computer-mediated communication only go back to the 1980s and 90s. So it's very recent information. So this is going to greatly expand and change as time goes by. Computer-mediated communication actually became a really strong scholarly field because of all those studies and because of the increased usage. It became far more prolific because as people utilize it, now we're seeing the ramifications of usage. You hate to say it, but we're kind of like guinea pigs. We're the test market to see what's going to actually come out of this particular field of study. We also need to look at a few definitions. So computer-mediated communication, as defined in this particular chapter that I had for you to read, it refers to human communication achieved through or with the help of computer technology. Now, that becomes really important because when we talk about computer-mediated communication, there's a lot of ways we could go. We could talk about data, we could talk about the different types of technology, but this particular class and the study of CMC actually focuses more on the human interpersonal communication elements. So they're talking about how social interaction occurs via these mediated formats. Then the textbook kind of takes a little shift and it says, okay, let's break this down and let's define communication. And what ends up occurring is that we start to compare communication as a mediated format versus as compared to communication that's face to face. And so this the challenge becomes that we're looking at how we do it in the real world, we'll call it the real world, versus how we do it in the mediated world. We recognize that all communication is actually mediated, but this is a matter of how we do it, comparing the two. So two of the ways that we look at communication is we look at communication as something that's transmission, or we look at something that is called constitutive. And if you've taken some communication courses before, this was what I was kind of getting at when I asked the question, have you taken any communication classes before? Are there any elements that are similar from this reading as compared to what maybe you've learned before? And made me a little nervous that some of you had taken communication classes, but you didn't recognize any of the same dynamics. I'm sure they were there in the classes. But let's talk about this element here between viewing communication as transmission versus viewing communication as constitutive. When we look at it as transmission, we're talking about a sender and a receiver. That goes back to Shannon and Weaver's models of somebody has a message and then they have to get it to another individual. When we look at transmission as communication as transmission, we're just talking about getting information from one thing to the other. It becomes just sort of like communication happens in a bottle, and you pour the communication into the bottle and you take the bottle from one person to the other. The communication remains the same, the shape of the bottle, and the bottle gets it from one person to the other. When we switch and we look at constitutive, communication now is used as a method to share meaning. So it's about social construction. So it's no longer in a vessel that gives the shape to the communication. Instead, the communication actually shapes the vessel. So it's a little bit more similar to maybe a river, where as the water flows, it actually changes the landscape, if you will. What we found in the study of communication is that communication actually creates relationships rather than it being the medium that causes the creation. So let's talk about some of the basic principles of communication. And again, these are some elements that you should have heard in your especially interpersonal communication classes, but also in your group classes and maybe even in your public speaking or intercultural. So some basic principles. First of all, communication is dynamic. It's a process. It's not static. Meaning doesn't reside in people, meaning doesn't reside in words. Meaning resides in people. So the people give the words meaning. I know in my classes I've always used this as an example, but the letters T-A-B-L-E have absolutely no meaning whatsoever. They are just letters put together. It's a word that we can pronounce, but we give it meaning because we've agreed that a table is maybe a wooden or a flat surface with legs underneath it. So the meaning doesn't reside in the actual symbol, the letters that we use to put together to create that. Instead, the meaning resides in our minds that we recognize, oh, that's what they're talking about. Communication is also transactional because meaning is negotiated via the interaction. So communication doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens between individuals. And when I communicate to someone and they respond back, that's when we know that communication has occurred. It's transactional. I also want to point out that your book mentioned how words change their meaning from time to time, or depending upon where you are, a particular word can have one meaning in one location and a different meaning in another. The third one is that communication is multifunctional. So communication serves many different functions. If you've taken a public speaking or group communication class, you know this. We do speeches to inform, speeches to persuade, and we do speeches to entertain. Those are the three types of functions for public speaking. But in addition to that, we also know, especially if you've had interpersonal communication, that communication is also multifunctional because sometimes we're trying to persuade people to do things, other times we're trying to control the situation. So it's multifunctional. And the last one is that communication is multimodal. Meta messages exist because we don't just read the verbal message, we also read the nonverbal message. So we look at the full package, where someone says it, how someone says it, the way that they said it, what was their body saying at the time. All of those things create a much deeper, richer message than just the words themselves. So now we'll move on to mediated. And mediated is talking about how the message gets from one person to the other person. And we know that we choose a medium between our sender and our receiver, right? It has to go on along a channel somewhere to get to the other individual. So this mediated process is nothing new. The fact that we're using a computer or a cell phone to do it is somewhat relatively new, but we've always used mediation. Our channels can be our language. I give you a list here. There's social or cultural channels of communication where we either create relationships or because of our relationships we communicate. We have stereotypes for certain people so that we view them, or we view that they will view the communication a particular way. We have the psychological channels, which are our perceptions, which if you've had interpersonal communication, you know perceptions are constructed. So how do I think this is going to occur? Then, of course, we have linguistic or symbolic, which is the words, using words or using sign language or using gestures in order to convey a message. And then we have material or technical, which includes writing, TV, radio, computers. And then the last thing I wanted to cover in Chapter 1 is the idea of computer, which I'm sure now that you've read, you recognize that it's not as easy to define as you thought it was. We have computers in all kinds of things now. We utilize computers in our cars. We computerized telephones. Our television even receives images now and signals via the internet. Your clocks, your alarms in your homes, your dishwasher, probably your refrigerator. There's computerization everywhere. In addition to that, one of the things that becomes really important is this idea that we're taking face-to-face communication and we're kind of trying to replicate it through technology. And so that's created some really interesting facets because we're missing out on the facial expressions and the nonverbal messages. So what do? We invent emojis. We try to put it in certain kind of font so people know that we're joking, or we say things like LOL. But that's also driven us to replicate that facial element that's just not there. So we have, webcams now, and we have web conferencing. So computers do more than help with human conversation, but that's specifically the focus of this particular class, is we're going to focus on the human element within computer-mediated communication. Okay, that's enough for Chapter 1. I'll be talking about Chapter 2 probably in the next couple of days, and I'll post another video. Hopefully that cleared up some of the questions from Chapter 1 that you had in your writings. And keep doing great job. Keep doing those great posts. I'm really loving the discussions. I'm going to kind of sit back and let you guys talk to each other quite a bit because I like the engagement and seeing how you guys are creating a classroom which is a human interaction on a mediated format. So have a great day. Have a great week. Bye.